One of the people I interviewed was the nephew of David Atlee Phillips, named Sean. And according to Sean Phillips, just before his death, David Atlee Phillips told his brother, who was Sean's father, that he was in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd. Now, we've placed David Atlee Phillips in the training camps, the anti-Castro training camps. We place him with Oswald, and now we see that somehow he is there in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, looking over what there is to see. I doubt he was certainly not a shooter, but he was there.
It's amazing. I mean, that's amazing. And you had some information that I had not seen before that said that Lee Harvey Oswald was debriefed at Atsugi. Is that how you pronounce that? I'm not sure. After the defection?
I found new information about Oswald being debriefed even in New York. Information that is not in A Farewell to Justice, but that I managed to get my hands on. So people always said, well, how come Oswald wasn't debriefed? Yes, he was. And there was, of course, also CIA people at Atsugi who testified that Oswald was involved with the CIA and involved in the Kennedy assassination. And that's James Wilcon. And that, again, then, of course, the government has to discredit the witness. And one of the people who discredited that witness was named Harold Leap, who worked for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And Robert Burris, who was the police investigator for the state of Louisiana, said he spotted him instantly as a CIA operative who had infiltrated the House Select Committee on Assassinations.
And actually, how about that whole Bolton Ford incident?
At Bolton Ford, which is a Ford dealership, two people come and they want to buy trucks or Jeeps, whatever, to go to Cuba. And one of them is named Oswald and the other is named Moore. And it turns out, of course, that the real Oswald is in the Soviet Union at this time. So who is this person coming to, and I think it's clearly part of the setting up of Oswald as a pro-Castro. Perhaps it's also setting up the idea that the CIA entertained for a period of time that they would blame Castro for the assassination of President Kennedy. Then they didn't need this grief. They feel it wasn't necessary. Really, the best way to get rid of this whole issue, which they've never been able to get rid of, is to say that Oswald was the lone assassin. Now, Jim Garrison, if you look at the Warren report and you see all the references to Oswald as unstable, he's a sociopath, he's not all there, Jim Garrison made a connection between the description of Oswald in the Warren report and the fact that Oswald was given the assignment of getting a job at an insane asylum. Because, okay, he's in the insane, he was already acting erratically there when Dr. Frank Silva saw him. I was the first one to interview Dr. Silva, and no, even certainly the Warren Commission were not interested. Well, what happened there to thwart that effort, that Oswald never got the job, is because Frank Silva, who happened to be from Cuba, but he was what Jim Garrison would call a legitimate Cuban, and he'd come to the United States in the 1950s. He was a psychiatrist, and he happened to walk by, and one of the orderlies said, listen, you know, here's a guy who's talking about going to Cuba to kill Fidel Castro because he knew Dr. Silva was Cuban. Well, Dr. Silva sees this disheveled figure in a t-shirt trying to get a job, and of course he's the medical director of the hospital, and so Dr. Silva thinks to himself, as he told me, no way this man gets a job at my hospital. So the whole CIA plan of getting Oswald into the hospital, and then maybe he would be so erratic that they'd make him a patient rather than an employee. He would escape. He would wind up in Dealey Plaza as an escaped insane person and be the lone assassin, insane. And that's why and his motive then, he didn't need a motive, you see. And Judge Burt Griffin, whom I talked to, was one of the lawyers who was involved at the time with the Warren Commission, admitted to me one of the problems that the young lawyers who were working for the Warren Commission had is that they couldn't find a motive for Oswald. Well, if you prove he's insane, you don't need a motive. And I thought that was really a very interesting line of analysis that Jim Garrison made.
Didn't Jack tell Thomas Edward Beckham also to get it?
Yes. Jack Martin told Thomas Edward Beckham, we have a whole series of these patsies being with a taint of having been in mental hospitals. Jack Martin told Beckham, it was in Mandeville, I think, go and check yourself in to the hospital. Now, at that time, Thomas Edward Beckham was a fake priest running a mission, supposedly collecting money for Cuba, to get rid of Castro. And so in his priest outfit, he goes to this insane asylum in Mandeville, and he's with his brother and his mother. So they think the brother is the one that's committing himself, because how could the priest be committing himself? Of course, they assumed he was really a priest. It's sort of a comedy in a way. It would make a great comedy.
Amazing. Crawford?
Crawford was somebody who was working for Jack Ruby in the Carousel Club. And he was sort of a roustabout. He worked at a carnival, and he swept up at the Carousel Club, and he was often mistaken for Oswald. He seemed to look like Oswald, and I think he saw Oswald at the Carousel Club, so he would have been another of those witnesses. Now, Crawford certainly knew something because he got himself out of Dallas awfully fast, I think on the day after the assassination. And I talked to his brother, and I talked to him, actually. Of course, that's not that he would make any admissions to me, but his brother was very suspicious of what he knew about the Kennedy assassination. And he was interviewed by the Warren Commission, but they really weren't very energetic in following up his answers.
You had some interesting stuff that I didn't know about, like Tippet, that he was identified as a part-time gun runner.
Tippet knew the Perrins, and the Perrins were one of the Robert Lee Perrin was a person in New Orleans whom Boxley, the CIA agent who infiltrated Jim Garrison's office, accused of having been involved with the Kennedy assassination, only to learn that he died before the assassination, and it was a way of discrediting Garrison. This was going to really destroy Jim Garrison's investigation, except Garrison nipped it in the bud and got rid of Boxley at that point. And Perrin apparently was a gun runner also, and his wife was, and they knew Tippett in that capacity. Ruby himself had dealings with selling things to Cuba. All these people really were connected. I don't know the whole Tippett story myself, but there's been a lot of research about that. I do know that the witnesses to the shooting of Tippett described a person who was not Lee Harvey Oswald. Mm-hmm. Jim Garrison wondered whether Crawford was involved in the death of Tippett because he seemed to be wearing a windbreaker that bore resemblance to the person and so forth. All of that. So nobody was investigating. And the federal government sent people to Dallas, particularly a lawyer named Herbert J. Miller Jr., sent to Dallas right after the assassination to make sure that the state of Texas did not investigate. Although the murder of the president was a Texas crime. It was not a federal crime at that time. Now it is, but it wasn't at that time. Why? And Herbert J. Miller Jr., so close to Robert Kennedy, worked in the Department of Justice, is the person who was sent to prevent the Texas law enforcement from investigating the Kennedy assassination. This has to give one pause.
Also,